Chapter 4. The Privateer's Rendezvous. When morning broke, the vessel that the privateer had been watching in the night was seen to be 3 miles directly ahead. She was a large vessel, and for some time opinions differed as to whether she was a frigate or an Indiaman. But when it became quite light, a patch or two in the canvas showed that she could not be a man of war, and all sail was at once crowded on to the privateer. The other ship at once shook out more canvas, but half an hour sufficed to show that the privateer was much the faster vessel. The stranger took in the extra canvas she had set, and continued her course as if altogether regardless of the privateer. "They have made up their minds to fight," the Jacques said to Ralph. "Now he finds that he can't outsail us, he has got on to easy working canvas. She is a big ship, and I expect carries heavier metal than we do. It may be that she has troops on board." The brig kept beating out to windward until she gained a position about a mile upon the starboard quarter of the Indiaman. Then the long pivot gun was levelled and the first shot fired. The crew had by this time all taken their places by the guns, and Ralph and the other boys brought up powder and shot from the magazine. It was not without a struggle that Ralph brought himself to do this, but he saw that a refusal would probably cost him his life, and as someone else would bring up the cartridges in his place, his refusal would not benefit his countrymen. He just come on deck when the gun was fired, and saw the water thrown up just under the ship's stern, and the shot was dancing away to leeward. The next shot struck the merchantman on the quarter. A moment later the vessel was brought up into the wind, and a broadside of 8 guns fired. 2 of them struck the hull of the privateer, another wounded the mainmast, while the rest cut holes through the sails and struck the water a quarter of a mile to windward. With an oath the captain of the privateer brought his vessel up into the wind, and then paid off on the other tack. The merchantman carried much heavier metal than he had given her credit for. As she came round too, some redcoats were seen on her deck. Apparently well satisfied with the display she had made of her strength, the ship bore off again and went quietly on her way, while the privateer was hove to and preventer stays put up to the mainmast. Ralph remained below for some time. He had heard the men savagely cursing, and thought it was best for him not to attract attention at present. The sails were lowered, and the brig drifted quietly all day, but about 10 o'clock Ralph heard a creaking of blocks and knew that the sails had been hoisted again. Half an hour later the watch below was ordered to come quietly on deck. Ralph went up with the rest. For a quarter of an hour he could see nothing, and then he made out a dark mass a few hundred yards to leeward. Immediately afterward the helm was put up and the brig run down toward the stranger. 2 minutes later there was a sharp hail, followed instantly by shouts and the sound of feet. But before the crew could gain the deck and prepare for defence, the brig was alongside, and a moment later her crew sprang upon the decks of the stranger. A few blows were given, but the resistance offered was slight, and in a very short time the crew was disarmed or driven below, and the vessel in the possession of the privateer. She proved to be a small bark on her way out to the Mediterranean. She carried only 20 hands and 4 small guns, and was laden with hardware. The privateer's crew at once set to work upon her. At first Ralph could not understand what they were about, but he was not long in discovering. The wedges round the mainmast were knocked out, the topmast lowered to the deck, the shrouds and stays slacked off, and then the mast was lifted and carried on board the brig. As soon as this was done, the second mate of the brig with 8 sailors went on board as a prize crew. Everything was made taut and trim for them by the brig's crew. The English prisoners had already been disarmed and battened down in the hold, and the prize crew then hoisted sail and prepared to take her under mizzen and foremast only to a French port. This, if she had luck, she would reach in safety, but if on the way she fell in with a British privateer or cruiser, she would of course fall an easy prey. No sooner was the bark on her way than the privateersmen set to work to lift out their injured mainmast, and to replace it with that they had brought on board from the bark. When the daylight broke, anxious glances were cast round the horizon, but although a few distant sails were seen, none of these were following a course that would bring them near the brig, and the latter, without sail and with her foremast alone standing, would not be likely to be noticed. Ralph could not help admiring the energy with which the crew worked. Ordinarily they were by no means a smart crew, and did their work in a slow and slovenly manner, but each man now felt the importance of getting everything into order before an enemy appeared, and so well did they work that by midday the new mast was in its place, and before sunset the topmast with all its yards and gear was up and the sails ready for hoisting. Ralph had been in a state of anxiety in the early part of the night, lest he should be sent on board the bark and carried as a prisoner to France, but no one seemed to give a thought to him, and it was not until far on in the morning that the captain happened to notice him hard at work with the rest. "Ah, you are there," he said. "If I had thought of it I would have sent you into Brest with the bark." Ralph did not understand the words, but he guessed at the meaning, and said, smiling, "I am quite content to remain where I am." "Tell him, Jacques Clery, that I have noticed that he works willingly, and as long as he behaves well he shall have the same treatment as if he belonged really to the crew. But warn him that if he is caught at any time making a signal, or doing anything to warn a vessel we may be approaching, his brains will be blown out at once." Jacques translated the warning. "That's all right," Ralph said. "Of course I should expect nothing else." As soon as the repairs were completed the sails were hoisted, and the brig proceeded on her way. In the days that followed it seemed to Ralph that the tactics of the privateer had changed, and that there was no longer any idea of making prizes. A sharp lookout was indeed kept for any English cruisers, but no attention was paid to any sail in the distance as soon as it was determined that these were not ships of war. 4 days later, instead of there being as before 5 or 6 sail in sight at one point or other of the horizon, the sea was absolutely deserted. He remarked upon this to his friend Jacques. The latter laughed. "We are out of their course now, my lad. We passed the latitude of Cape St. Vincent yesterday evening, and we are now pretty well off the coast of Africa. 9 out of 10 of the ships we have seen were either bound to the Mediterranean or on their way home. Now that we have passed the mouth of the strait we shall not run across many sail." "Oh, where are we going to then?" Ralph said. "Well, I don't think there is any harm in telling you now, but we are bound south, but how far is more than I know. I expect first we shall go west and try and pick up some prizes among the islands, and after that perhaps go round the cape and lie in wait for Indiamen on their way home. You see, one of those ships is worth a dozen of these Mediterranean traders, and one is not bothered down there as one is between the strait and the channel with your cruisers and privateers. They swarm so that not one can hardly fire a gun without bringing them down on us. I don't suppose the captain would have meddled with that Indiaman if it hadn't been that he thought the owners would be pleased by a prize being sent in so soon. As to the bark, we were obliged to take her to get a new mast. It would never have done to have started on a long cruise with a badly injured spar." "But I should think it would be difficult to send home prizes from the West Indies," Ralph said. "Well, you see, although you have taken most of our islands, there are still 2 or 3 ports we can take prizes into. Besides, we can take the best goods out, and if the ship isn't worth the risk of sending to France, burn her. Then, too, one can spare hands for prizes better there, because one can always ship a few fresh hands, Spaniards, mulattoes, or blacks, in their place." "But you can't do that in the case of the Indiaman." "No, but a single laden Indiaman is enough to pay us well for all our trouble. We can put a crew of 30 hands on board her and send her home. There is little risk of a recapture till we get near France. We have only to hoist the English flag if we do happen to meet anything." Ralph was glad to hear that the ship was bound for the West Indies, as he thought opportunities for escape would be likely to present themselves among the islands. Madeira was sighted 3 days later, and after running south for another 400 or 500 miles the brig bore away for the west. By dint of getting Jacques Clery to translate sentences into French, and of hearing nothing but that language spoken round him, Ralph had by this time begun to make considerable progress in the language. Not only was he anxious to learn it for the sake of passing away the time and making himself understood, but his efforts were greatly stimulated by the fact that if any of the crew addressed him in French, a cuff on the head was generally the penalty of a failure to comprehend him. The consequence was that when 6 weeks after sailing the cry of land was shouted by the lookout in the tops, Ralph was able to understand almost everything that was said, and to reply in French with some fluency. As the brig sailed along the wooded shores of the first island they fell in with, Ralph was leaning against the bulkheads, watching with deep interest the objects that were passing. "I can guess what you are thinking about," Jacques Clery said, taking his place quietly by Ralph's side. "I've been through it all myself, and I can guess your feelings. You are thinking how you can escape. Now, you take my advice and don't you hurry about it. You are doing well where you are. Now you begin to talk French and understand orders, it's a good deal easier for you than it was, and the men are beginning to regard you as one of themselves. But you may be sure that you will be watched for a time. You see, they daren't let you go. If you were to get to one of the English ports here, we should have 5 or 6 of your men of war after us in no time. If it was not for that, I don't suppose the captain would object to put you ashore. He has evidently taken a fancy to you, and is pleased with the way in which you have taken things, and with your smartness and willingness. Besides, I don't think he considers you altogether as a prisoner. Running you down in the way he did in the channel wasn't like capturing you in a prize, and I think if the captain could see his way to letting you go without risk to himself, he'd do it. As he can't do that, he'll have a sharp watch kept on you, and I advise you not to be in a hurry to try to escape. You must remember, if you were caught trying, they would shoot you to a certainty." "I should be in no hurry at all, Jacques, if it were not that the brig is hunting for English vessels. You know that you could feel yourself if you were on board a ship that was capturing French craft." "Yes, that is hard, no doubt," Jacques agreed. "And I don't say to you don't escape when you get a chance. I only say wait until the chance is a good one. Just at present we are not specially on the lookout for prizes. We are going to join 2 other vessels belonging to the same owners. They have been out here some time and have got a snug hiding place somewhere, though I don't think anyone on board except the captain knows where." For 3 weeks the brigs cruised along the island. They had picked up no prizes in that time, as the captain did not wish to commence operations until he had joined his consorts and obtained information from them as to the British men of war on the station. They had overhauled 1 or 2 native craft, purchased fish and fruit, and cautiously asked questions as to the cruisers. The answers were not satisfactory. They learned that, owing to the number of vessels that had been captured by the privateers, a very vigilant lookout was being kept, that 2 or 3 French craft that had been captured by the cruisers had been bought into the service, and were constantly in search of the headquarters of the privateers. This was bad news, for although the brig with her great spread of canvas could in light winds run away from any of the ships of war, it was by no means certain she would be able to do so from the converted privateers. One morning 2 vessels, a schooner and a brig, were seen coming round a headland. The captain and officers examined them with their telescopes, and a flag was run up to the masthead. Almost immediately 2 answering flags were hoisted by the strangers, and an exclamation of satisfaction broke from the captain. "We are in luck," he said. "If we had not run across them we might have had to search for the rendezvous. I have got the spot marked down on the chart, but they told me before sailing they understood it was very difficult to find the entrance, and we might pass by within 100 yards without noticing it." In half an hour the ships closed up together, and the captains of the other craft came on board in their boats. A hearty greeting was exchanged between them and the captain of La Belle Marie, and the 3 then descended to the cabin. After a time they reappeared, and the visitors returned to their respective ships. 5 minutes later the schooner got under way, and La Belle Marie followed her, leaving the other brig to continue her cruise alone. Toward evening the schooner ran in toward a precipitous cliff, the brig keeping close in her wake. Ralph had no doubt that they were now close to the spot the privateers used as their rendezvous, but he could detect no opening into the cliff ahead, and it looked as if the schooner was leading the way to destruction. Not until within a cable's length of the shore could any opening be discovered by the keenest eye. Then, when the schooner was within her own length of the cliff, her helm was put about, she came round, and in a moment later disappeared. An exclamation of surprise broke from all on board the brig, for they now saw that instead of the cliff stretching in an unbroken line, it projected out at one point, and the precipitous headway concealed an extremely narrow passage behind it. A moment later the brig imitated the maneuver of the schooner, and passed in between 2 lofty cliffs, so close that there were but a few yards to spare on either side of her. 50 yards ahead the channel made a sharp turn again, and they entered a basin of tranquil water 300 or 400 yards across. At the further end the shore sloped gradually up, and here several large storehouses had been erected, and ways laid down for the convenience of hauling up and repairing the vessels. "What do you think of that, youngster?" Jacques said exultantly. "A grand hiding place, is it not?" "Oh, it is indeed," Ralph replied. "Why, they might cruise outside for weeks looking for the place, and they wouldn't find it, unless a boat happened to row along at the foot of the cliffs." As soon as the anchor was down the crew were at once given leave to go ashore and ramble about to stretch their legs after their 2 months' confinement on board. Ralph was proceeding to take his place in one of the boats when the captain's eye fell upon him. "Come below with me, young fellow," he said in French. "Jacques Clery, I shall want you too." "I do not think there is much need of interpreting, Captain," the sailor said, as he followed the others into the cabin. "The lad can get on very fairly in French now, and will certainly understand the sense of anything you may say to him." "Look here, my lad," the captain began, "you have been fairly treated since you came on board this brig." "I have been very kindly treated," Ralph said. "I have nothing whatever to complain of." "And we saved your life, did we not?" Yes, sir, after first nearly taking it," Ralph said with a smile. "That is just as much your fault as ours. Little fish ought to get out of the way of great ones, and I don't consider we are in any way to blame in that matter. Still, there is the fact, in the first place we saved your life, and in the second we treated you kindly." "I acknowledge that, sir," Ralph said earnestly, "and I feel very grateful. You might have sent me with the crew of that bark to prison had you chosen, and I am thankful to you that you kept me on board and have treated me as one of the crew. Now that I have to say to you is this, lad. I know that you are comfortable enough on board, and I have noticed that Jacques here has taken you specially under his wing. You work willingly and well, and have the makings of a first class seaman in you. Still, I can understand that you would much rather be with your own people, and would be rather aiding them in capturing us than in aiding us to capture them. Consequently, you will, if you see an opportunity, probably try to escape. I shall take as good care as I can to prevent you from doing so, and shall shoot you without hesitation if I catch you at it. Still, you may escape, and I cannot run the risk of having this place discovered and our trade knocked on the head. I therefore offer you an alternative. You will either give me your solemn oath not in any case to reveal the existence of this place, or I will put you on shore in charge of the party who remain here, and you will stop with them a prisoner till we sail away from this cruising ground, which may be in 3 months or may be in a year. What do you say? Don't answer me hastily, and do not take the oath unless you are convinced you can keep it, however great the temptation held out to you to betray us." Ralph needed but a minute to consider the proposition. The oath did not bind him in any way to abstain from making an attempt to escape, but simply to guard the secret of the privateer rendezvous. If he remained here on shore he would have no chance whatever of escape, and might moreover meet with very rough treatment from those left in charge of him. "I am quite ready to take the oath not to reveal the secret of this place, Captain," he said. "I do not think that in any case, after having been so kindly treated by you, I should have been inclined to betray you. However, as you offer me the alternative, I am ready to take any oath you like of silence, and that oath I will assuredly keep, whatever pressure may be laid upon me, it being understood, of course, that the oath in no way prevents my taking any opportunity that may present itself of making my escape." "That is quite understood," the captain said. "That is a mere matter of business. You try to escape if you can. I shoot you if I catch you at it. But I do not think you are likely to succeed. But in justice to my employers and friends I should not be justified in running even that slight risk unless convinced that if you succeed you will keep silence as to this. Now, what oath will you take?" "No oath can be more binding to me than my promise, sir, but at the same time I swear upon my word of honour that I will never give any information or hint that will lead anyone to the discovery of this harbour." "That will do," the captain said. "I have liked your face from the moment you came on board, and I feel that I can trust your word." "I am sure you can do that, Captain," Jacques put in. "From what I have seen of the boy I am certain that he will keep whatever promise he has made." "Very well, then," the captain said. "That is settled. You can go on shore in the next boat, and I shall advise you to take the opportunity, for I warn you that you will not get the chance of rambling on shore again until we return here next time. You need not come on board before tomorrow morning." Half an hour later Ralph went ashore with the last batch of sailors. He soon found that a general license had been granted, a barrel of rum and several casks of wine had been broached, and the men were evidently bent upon making up for the spell of severe discipline that they had lately gone through. Jacques Clery had gone ashore in the same boat with Ralph. "What are you going to do, lad?" "I am going for a walk," Ralph said. "In the first place, everything is new to me, and I want to see the vegetation; and in the second place, I can see that in a very short time most of the hands will be drunk, and I dare say quarrelsome, and I don't want either to drink or quarrel. Personally, I think I am better away from them." "You are right, boy, and I don't care if I go too. We will take a drink of wine before we start and fill our pockets with those biscuits. I'll get the scorekeeper to give us a bottle of wine to take with us, and then we shall be set up for the day. This is my first voyage in these parts, but I have heard from others of their doings and don't care about getting a stab with a knife in a drunken brawl. I can do my share of fighting when fighting has got to be done, but I do not care for rows of this sort. Still, I know the men look forward to what you call a spree on shore, and the captain might find it difficult to preserve discipline if he did not let them have their fling occasionally." Ralph and the sailor each took a biscuit and a draught of wine, and soon afterwards started on their ramble, provided with food as arranged. Both were delighted with the luxuriant vegetation, and wandered for hours through the woods admiring the flowers and fruits, abstaining, however, from tasting the latter, as for aught they knew some of the species might be poisonous. Presently, however, they came upon some bananas. Neither of them had ever seen this fruit before, but Ralph had read descriptions of it in books. Jacques had heard of it from the sailors who had visited the West Indies before. They therefore cut some bunches. "Now we'll bring ourselves to an anchor and dine. Time must be getting on, and my appetite tells me that it must have struck 8 bells." Jacques sat down on the ground and was about to throw himself full length when Ralph observed a movement among the dead leaves. An instant later the head of a snake was raised threateningly within striking distance of Jacques Cléry's neck. As he sank backward, Ralph gave a short cry, too late, however, to arrest the sailor's movements, and at the same moment sprang forward and came down with both feet upon the snake. "What on earth are you doing?" Jacques asked as he scrambled to his feet. No answer was made to his question, but he saw at once that Ralph had stamped upon the writhing folds of a snake. In a minute the motion ceased. "That was a close shave, Jacques," Ralph said, smiling, though his face was pale with the sudden excitement. "I did not see it until too late to give you a warning. It was just the fraction of a second, and even as I jumped I thought he would strike your neck before my boot came on him." "You saved my life, lad," the other said huskily, trembling from head to foot, as he saw how narrowly indeed he had escaped from death. "I have been in some hard fights in my time, but I don't know that ever I felt as I feel now. I feel cold from head to foot, and I believe that a child could knock me down. Give me your hand, lad. It was splendidly done. If you had stopped for half a moment to think, I should have been a dead man. Good heavens, what an escape I had!" "Oh, I am glad to have been of service for once. You have been so kind to me since I came aboard the brig that it's fair that I should do you a good turn for once. I am not surprised you are shaken, for I feel so myself. We had better both have a drink of wine, and then we can see about our meal." "No more lying on the ground for me," the sailor said. "Once is enough of such a thing as that. However, hand me the bottle. I shall feel better after that." Ralph looked about and presently discovered an open space free from fallen leaves or any other shelter for a lurking snake, and persuaded Jacques to sit down and eat his biscuit and bananas in comfort. The sailor did so, but the manner in which his glances kept wandering round him in search of snakes showed that he had not yet recovered his equanimity. When they had finished their meal, Ralph proposed that they should climb up to the highest point of ground they could find and take a view over the island. 2 hours' walking took them to the top of a lofty hill. From the summit they were enabled to obtain a distant view. The island was, they judged, some 7 or 8 miles across, and fully twice that length. Several small islands lay within a few miles distant, and high land rose 20 miles off. "This must be a large island," Ralph said. "Do you know where we are, Jacques?" "I have no idea whatever," the sailor said, "and I don't suppose anyone on board except the officers has, any more than me. The charts are all in the captain's cabin, and I know no more of the geography of these islands than I do of the South Seas, and that's nothing. It's quite right to keep it dark, because though I don't suppose many fellows on board any of the 3 craft would split upon us if you were captured, because you see we each have a share in the profits of the voyage as well as our regular pay, and of course we should lose that if those storehouses, which are pretty well choked up with goods, were to be taken. There's never any saying what some mean scamp might do if he were offered a handsome reward. So the fewer as knows the secret, the better. Look, Jacques, look at that full-rigged ship that's just come out from behind that island. She looks to me like a frigate." "And that she is," the sailor replied. "Carries 40 guns, I should say, by her size. English, no doubt." "Well, we had better go back down again, lad. I must report to the captain that this craft is cruising in these waters. It will be dark before we are back, and I don't want to be in the woods after dark. There's no saying what one might tread on. I thought that we would stretch ourselves out under the trees for tonight and go aboard in the morning, but I feel different now. Bless you, I should never close an eye. So I propose as we goes down so as not to be noticed by them chaps up at the store, and then gets a hold of a boat and rows on board quiet." "I am quite willing to do that, Jacques. I don't think I should get much sleep either in the woods." "No, I guess not, lad. Come along, the sun is halfway down already, and I would not be left in these woods after dark, not for 6 months' pay. The thought of that snake makes me crawl all over. Who would have thought now, when I lugged you in over the bowsprit of La Belle Marie that night in the channel, that you were going to save my life some day? Well, I don't suppose, lad, I shall ever get quits with you, but if there's a chance you can count on me. You come to me any night and say I am going to escape, Jacques, and I will help you do it, even if they riddle me with bullets 5 minutes afterward." "Oh, I shall never ask that of you, Jacques," Ralph said warmly. I consider we're quits now, though you may not. Indeed, I can tell you that I don't consider that 2 months of kindness are wiped out by just taking a jump on the back of a snake." There were loud sounds of shouting, singing, and quarrelling as they passed near the great fires that were blazing near the storehouse. They reached the waterside without notice, and taking a boat rowed off to the brig. The captain looked over the side. "Who is that?" "Jacques Cléry and the English lad, Captain." "You got tired of the noise on shore, I suppose," the captain said. "Not exactly that, Captain, for we have not yet been near the others at all. We took a long walk through the woods up to the top of the hill in the middle of the island, and we came back for 2 reasons. The first, because I have been so badly scared by a snake, who would have bit me had not this young lad leaped on my back just as he was about to strike me in the neck, that I would not have slept on the ground for anything. And in the second place, we came to tell you that from the top of the hill we saw a large frigate, English I should say from the cut of her sails, 5 or 6 miles off on the other side of the island, and I thought you ought to know about her at once." "Thank you, Jacques. That is important. I was going to sail in the morning, but we must not stir as long as she is in the neighbourhood. So this young fellow saved your life, did he?" "That he did, Captain, and it was the quickest thing you ever saw. I was just lying down at full length when he caught sight of the snake. There was no time to stop me, no time even to cry out. He just jumped on a sudden and came down on the brute as it was on the point of striking. Had he stopped for 1/4 of a second I should have been a dead man hours ago." "And that was a near escape indeed, Jacques. Are they pretty quiet there on shore? I heard them shouting several times." "They seem quarrelling a bit, Captain, but they are sure to do that with all that liquor on hand." "They won't come to much harm," the captain said. "I gave the strictest orders that all weapons should be left behind before they landed, and that any man carrying even a knife would have his leave stopped during the rest of the cruise. Besides, the first mate is there to look after them. I will go ashore myself at daybreak and take a look round from the top of that island. If that frigate is still cruising about near the island, it must be because they have got some sort of an idea of the whereabouts of our hiding place. We must wait till she moves away. It won't do to risk anything." Upon the following morning the captain and Jacques, accompanied by Ralph, landed. They passed close by the storehouse and saw the men still asleep round the extinguished fires. The captain called out the storekeeper. "You can serve out 1 pannikin of wine to each man," he said, "but no more. They will want that to pull themselves together. Tell the first mate to get them on board as soon as possible, and set them to work to tidy up the ship and get everything ready for setting sail at a moment's notice. Tell him an English frigate is reported as close to the island. I am going up to look after her." 2 hours' steady walking took them to the top of the hill. There were no signs of any vessel as far as they could see. The captain, who had brought his glass with him, carefully examined every island in sight. Presently he uttered an exclamation. "There are 3 boats rowing together close under the cliffs there," he said, pointing to the nearest island. "No doubt the frigate is lying behind it. They must be searching for some concealed harbour like ours. Peste! This is awkward. What do you think, Jacques?" "I should say you were right in what you said last night, Captain. They must have got an idea that our rendezvous is somewhere hereabouts, though they don't know for certain where, and they are searching all the island round. If they come along here like that we shall be caught in a trap. A vessel might sail close by without suspecting there was an entrance here, however hard they might be looking for it, but if they send boats rowing along the shore they couldn't help finding it. Still, there is nothing to prevent our sailing away now, as the island is between us and them." "That is so," the captain said, "but if they come while we are away, in the first place they would capture all the booty and the stores, and in the second place they might lie quiet in the harbour and would sink the other ships when they returned. I will go down to the port again, Jacques, and will send up 2 of the men from the storehouse to keep watch here, turn and turn about. Do you remain here until you are relieved. I will leave my glass with you. If there is anything fresh, leave the boy on watch and come down with the news yourself. I must talk this matter over with the mates. We have no direct interest in the stores, but we must do the best we can for our owners." Jacques and Ralph watched the distant boats through the glass until they disappeared round the end of the island, then turned the glass seaward. Jacques was using it at the time. "See," he exclaimed, "there are 3 sails together there." "I can see them plainly enough," Ralph said. "What do you make them out to be?" "A schooner, a brig, and a 3-masted vessel. They are lying close together, and I fancy boats are passing between them. However, I couldn't swear to that. They must be 15 miles away. I expect they are our consorts and a merchantman they have captured." "Can they see them from the other side of that island?" Ralph asked excitedly. "I should say they could," Jacques replied, after pausing to calculate the line of sight. "It depends how far round the frigate is lying, and how close in shore. But if they've sent anyone up on the hill there, of course they can make them out as plainly as we can." Jacques handed the glass back to Ralph. "Yes, I think I can make out our boats, Jacques. What do you suppose they are doing?" "Most likely they are transferring the valuable part of her cargo on board." "Well, what will they do with her then?" "Oh, I expect they will let her go, but of course that depends whether she is a new ship, and worth taking the risk of carrying her to France." "They don't burn or sink her, then?" "No, there would be no good in that, for they wouldn't know what to do with the crew. Of course they don't want the bother of prisoners here, and they wouldn't want to turn them adrift in the boats. They might land on some island near and see us going and coming here, and carry the news to some of your cruisers. No, I expect they will take what is valuable and let them go, that is, if the ship isn't worth sending home. I suppose that it is so in this case, for if they were going to put a prize crew on board and send it to France they would not be transferring the cargo. Well, we shall see in another half hour." Chapter 5: The British Cruisers. An hour passed. During this time the watchers on the hill saw that the brig had been lying alongside the three-masted vessel, and felt sure that the cargo was being transferred. Then the merchantman's sails were hoisted, and she slowly sailed away. For another hour the other two craft lay motionless. Then they hoisted sail and headed for the island. There was a brisk, steady wind blowing, and they came along fast through the water. "We shall soon see now whether your frigate has made them out," Jacques said. "But I will not wait any longer, but will go and tell the captain what is going on. In another hour the others will be up here to relieve you, then you can bring down the latest news." Left alone, Ralph watched anxiously the progress of the distant vessels, turning the glass frequently toward the other island, beyond the end of which he momentarily expected to see the white sails of the frigate appear. An hour passed. The schooner and the brig were now within about 4 miles of the nearest point of the island, and still there were no signs of the English ship. Presently he heard voices behind him, and 2 French sailors came up. Ralph was now free to return, but he thought he had better wait until the brig and schooner reached a point where they would be hidden by the island from the sight of anyone who might be watching on the hill 6 miles away. In another half hour they had reached this point. No sign had been seen of the frigate, and Ralph felt sure that she must have been anchored in some bay whose headland prevented her seeing the approaching craft, for had she noticed them she would assuredly have set out to intercept them before they reached the island, which lay almost dead to windward of them. He was just turning to go when one of the men gave a sudden exclamation. He turned round again, and saw the frigate just appearing from behind the other island. She was close hauled, and it was soon evident by her course that she was beating up for the point round which the other 2 ships had disappeared. Ralph was puzzled at this, for if she had made out the brig and schooner her natural course would have been to have made for the other end of the island, so as to cut them off as they sailed past it, whereas they would now, when they gained the extremity of the island, find themselves 5 or 6 miles astern of the other 2 craft. The French sailors were equally puzzled, and there was a hot argument between them, but they finally concluded that her appearance at that moment must be accidental, and she could not have made out the privateers. They had just told Ralph to run down with the news to the harbour, when a light was thrown upon the mystery, for from the other end of the island from which the frigate had emerged a large schooner appeared. Every sail was set, and her course was directed toward this other end of the island, upon which the watchers were standing. The 2 French sailors burst out into a torrent of oaths, expressing of surprise and alarm, for it was evident that from the course the schooner was taking she intended to intercept the 2 privateers and engage them until the frigate came to her assistance. "Run, boy, run for your life!" one of them exclaimed, "and tell the captain but no, wait a moment," and he directed the glass upon the schooner. "A thousand curses!" he exclaimed. "It is the Cerf schooner the English captured from us 6 months ago. She is the fastest craft in these waters. Tell the captain that I am coming after you, but your legs will beat mine." Ralph dashed off at full speed, but as soon as he had fairly distanced the French sailor he began to run more slowly. For the moment he had so entered into the feelings of his companions that he had identified himself with them, but now that he had time to think, his sympathies swung round to the English ship. He did not particularly want La Belle Marie to be captured, for he had been so well treated on board her that he felt no ill will toward her, but her capture meant his deliverance. He thought over the matter as he ran, and wondered first why the frigate did not take the line to cut the privateers off, instead of going round by the other end of the island. He could only suppose that it was because the schooner was the fastest vessel, and was more likely to arrive in time at the point. Besides, If she showed there before the privateers reached the point, they might double back again, and the frigate would make the other end of the island before they were halfway back. It might be, too, that the captain had suspected the truth, knowing that the privateers had a rendezvous somewhere in that neighbourhood, and that his object in remaining so long behind the island was to give them time to enter their port in ignorance of his being in the neighbourhood. At any rate, the great thing was that the schooner and brig should enter the little harbour before knowing that they were pursued. Once in, it would be impossible for them to get out again and beat off shore, with the wind blowing dead on the land, before both the schooner and frigate had rounded their respective ends of the island. Therefore, although Ralph ran fast enough to keep well ahead of the sailor, he made no effort to keep up a greater rate of speed than was necessary for this. As soon as he reached the shore, a boat rowed off from the brig to fetch him. He saw with satisfaction that although the men were all on board, no preparations were made for getting under way at once, and indeed the captain would have no anxiety for his own ship, as he would know that the privateers, if they saw the frigate coming out to meet them, would sail right away from the island, and the frigate would be sure to pursue until out of sight of land. "What news, boy?" the captain asked as the boat came alongside. "Is the frigate in chase of the others?" "Yes, sir," Ralph replied. "The frigate and schooner are both in chase." "Which way are they bearing?" "The privateers do not know they are chased, sir. The frigate did not show round the island over there until the schooner and brig were hidden behind the end of this island. She made toward the western end, and the schooner is making for the eastern end. The sailors who came up told me to tell you that the schooner is the Surf, one of the fastest vessels out here." The captain uttered an exclamation of dismay, which was echoed by those standing round him. "Row out through the entrance," he shouted to the coxswain of the boat, "and warn the others of the danger. Tell them to make straight out. If they come in here, we shall all be caught in a trap together." The oars dipped in the water, but before the boat was fairly in motion there was an exclamation, for the headsail of the schooner glided in past the projecting cliff. A moment later the whole vessel came into view. "Bring the boat back alongside," the captain shouted. "I will go on board her at once. She may get out in time yet." As the schooner rounded up, her sails came down, and she headed straight toward the brig. The captain of the Belle Marie stood up in the stern sheet of the boat, shouting and waving his hands and gesticulating to them to get up sail again. Those on board the schooner looked on in surprise, unable to guess his meaning. "There are 2 English cruisers, one coming round each end of the island," he shouted as he approached the schooner. "Get out again if you can, otherwise they must catch us all in here." The captain in the schooner at once saw the emergency, and roared out orders. The boats were all lowered at once, and the men tumbled on board. Hawsers were lowered from the bows, and they began at once to tow her head round, for there was not a breath of wind in the landlocked harbour. "How much time have we got?" the captain asked as the schooner's head came slowly round. "I don't know," the other captain replied. "It's a question of minutes, anyhow. Ah, here is the brig," and the boat dashed forward, and he gave similar orders to those that had been given to the schooner. "Get them both round," the captain shouted. "I will row out through the entrance and give you warning if these accursed cruisers are in sight." The boat dashed through the narrow entrance, and at once felt the full force of the breeze. "Dead on shore," the captain muttered bitterly. "They will have to work right out into the arms of one or the other of them." They rowed 100 yards out, when, beyond the furthest point they could see to the east, the sails of the schooner were perceived. "Take her round," the captain said sharply. "It's too late now. We've got to fight for it." They rowed back through the entrance. The schooner, slowly towed by her boats, was approaching. "It's no use," the captain said. "You are too late. The schooner has rounded the end of the island, and with this breeze will be here in half an hour. You never can work out in time. Besides, they would see you come out, and even if you got away, which you couldn't do, they'd come back and capture the depot. We've got to fight for it, that's evident, and the boats of a fleet could hardly make their way in here. We had best get the 3 craft moored with their broadsides to the entrance. We'll blow the boats to tinder if they try to come in, and then we can load up with all the most valuable goods and slip out at night time. That is our only chance." The captain of the schooner jumped into the boat, and they again rowed out into the entrance. He saw at once that the other's advice was the only one to be followed. It would be impossible to beat off the shore before the schooner came up, and while they were talking the frigate appeared round the other end of the island. They therefore returned to the harbour. The Belle Marie's anchor was raised, and the 3 vessels moored head to stern across the harbour, 100 yards from the entrance. As soon as this was done, strong parties were sent ashore from each of the vessels, and 6 heavy ship's guns that had been landed from some captured vessel were dragged from their place near the storehouse and planted on the heights, so as to sweep the narrow channel. It was late in the evening before this was done, and an earthwork thrown up to shelter the men working the guns from musketry fire. In the meantime the two ships of war had met outside, and again, separating, cruised several times from end to end of the rocky wall, evidently searching for the entrance through which the privateers they had been pursuing had so suddenly disappeared. In the morning the French sailors were at work early, and 2 or 3 strong chains were fastened across the mouth of the passage. "Now," the captain of the Belle Marie said exultantly as he regained the deck of his ship, "we are ready to give them a warm reception. The boats of all the British cruisers on the station would never force their way through that gap." Ralph had not been called upon to assist in the work of preparation, he and Jacques having done their day's work on the journey to the top of the hill and back. He saw from the exultation in the faces of the Frenchmen that they considered their position was impregnable, and he shuddered at the thought of the terrible carnage that would ensue if the boats of the English vessels should try to force the entrance. The following morning a lookout on the cliffs reported that 2 boats had left the ships and were rowing toward the shore. On reaching the foot of the cliffs they rowed along abreast at a distance of 30 or 40 yards of the shores. They stopped rowing at the mouth of the entrance, and were suddenly hailed by the captain of the schooner, who was standing on the cliff above. "If you try to enter," he said, "you will be destroyed at once. We don't want to harm you if you will leave us alone, but we have guns enough to blow a whole fleet out of water, and will use them if we are driven to it." "Thank you for your warning," a voice shouted back from the boats, and then an order was given, and they rowed back to the ships. "Well, have you found the place, Lieutenant Pearson?" the captain of the frigate asked as the young lieutenant stepped on deck. "Yes, sir, we have found it. It's just where the boat turned and came out again." "I can see no signs of it now," the captain said, examining the shore with his telescope. "No, sir, you wouldn't until you were within 100 yards of it, but rowing close in as we were, we saw it some time before we got there. The rocks overlap each other, and there's a narrow channel some 50 yards long between them. Apparently this makes a sharp turn at the other end and opens out. We saw nothing of the vessels we were chasing yesterday, but on high ground facing the channel there's a battery of 6 guns planted so as to rake anything coming in. There are some chains across the end as well. While we were lying on our oars there we were hailed," and he then repeated the warning that had been given. "Nasty place to get into, eh?" the captain said thoughtfully. "Very nasty, sir. You see, the guns would play right down into the channel. Then there are the chains to break down, and perhaps more batteries, and certainly the ships to tackle when we get inside." "Is there width for the frigate to enter?" the captain asked. "Just width, I should say, and no more, sir. We should certainly have to get the yards braced fore and aft, but the ship itself would go through with something to spare, I would say." "What depth of water is there close inshore?" "Oh, plenty of depth, sir, right up to the foot of the cliffs. But of course I can say nothing as to the depth in the channel." "No, of course not," the captain said. "Well, it's something that we have run these pests to earth at last, but I see it's going to be no easy matter to get at them." The captain now signalled to the captain of the schooner to come on board, and when he did so the 2 officers retired to the cabin together and had a long consultation. The young officer, on coming on deck, got into his boat, and taking Lieutenant Pearson with him, rowed for the cliffs a few hundred yards to the west of the inlet. Here they could obtain a view of the channel and its surroundings. Not a man was to be seen. The muzzles of the 6 guns pointed menacingly down into the passage, and the chains could be seen just above the water's edge. "I think we will go back now, Mr. Pearson. I really think we ought to be very much obliged to those fellows for not sinking us. I wonder what was their motive in letting us off so easily." "Oh, I suppose they feel pretty confident that our report is not likely to encourage an attack, and they think that if they were to blow us to pieces it would only make Captain Wilson the more determined to destroy them. At least that's the conclusion I came to as I rowed back last time." "Yes, I should think that is it," the young captain said. "It's certainly as awkward a looking place to attack in boats as I ever saw. Of course, were it not for the chains my vessel could get in, and I dare say she had been there many a time before we captured her. But it would be a very risky thing to take the frigate in without knowing anything of the depth of water either in the channel or inside." Both officers returned to the frigate. "Mr. Pearson's report is fully borne out, Captain Wilson. It would be a most desperate enterprise to attack with our boats. Half of them would be sunk before they got to the chains, and even if they got past them, which I doubt, there's no saying what difficulties and obstacles may be inside." And now about the frigate, Captain Chambers." "Well, sir, that is for you to decide. I am quite ready to take the schooner in, though with the plunging power of that battery raking her fore and aft, I say fairly that it would be a desperate enterprise, and if she had not sufficient way upon her to carry away the chains, nothing could save her. As to the frigate, it seems to me that she would run an equal risk with the schooner, with the additional danger that there may not be enough water for her." "Well, it certainly doesn't seem to be an easy nut to crack," Captain Wilson said. "As we agreed before you started, we should not be justified in risking both our vessels in assaulting a place which is certainly extremely formidable, and where there may not be enough water for the frigate to float. Still the question remains, what is to be done? It's no use anchoring here and trying to starve them out. They may have provisions enough to last them for years, for anything we know. If the weather were to turn bad, we should have to make off at once. It would never do to be caught in a hurricane with such a coast as that on our lee. I might send you to Port Royal with a letter to the admiral asking him to send us 2 or 3 more ships, but I don't like doing that when it's a mere question of capturing 2 rascally privateers." "Oh, I think the admiral would be glad to send them," the young captain said, "for these 2 vessels have done a tremendous lot of damage during the last year. I believe that upward of 20 ships have reported being boarded and stripped by them." "But if they came, what could they do?" Captain Wilson asked. "You see, we consider it's not worth the risk of throwing away 2 ships to force this passage, still less would it be to risk 4. "There is no doubt," Captain Chambers agreed. "I should suggest that however many of us there may be, we should all draw off and keep a watch at a distance. Of course it would be necessary to approach at night, and to lie behind the island somewhere in the daytime, just as we did yesterday, for from the top of that hill they can see any distance round." "Yes, and as soon as it's dusk they will have 2 or 3 hours to get away before we can come round here. Besides, with their night glasses from the top of the cliffs they will be sure to be able to make us out. There's only one other way that I can see of getting at them, and that is to find a landing place and attack them from on shore." "Ah, yes, that's a much more hopeful business. As far as I saw yesterday, there are cliffs all round the island, but it's hard indeed if we cannot find some place where we can manage to effect a landing. This is the plan we must follow out. This afternoon, an hour before it gets dark, you get up sail and make away as if you were bound for Port Royal. I shall keep my station here. They will think you have gone off to get some more ships. As soon as it's thoroughly dark, bear round and come back to the island. Bring the schooner in close to the cliffs on the other side, and get into a bay if you can find one. You'll then be out of sight altogether, unless somebody happens to look down from the edge of the cliffs above you. Then search the whole of the back of the island with boats, keeping at oar's length from the cliffs. There must be some place where a man can climb up, probably gullies worn by streams. Then tomorrow night sail round and join us again. I'll be waiting for you about 2 miles off the land, and will show a light to seaward so that you'll know where to find me. Then we can talk matters over, and you can get back to the other side again before morning." While the captains of the 2 English vessels were holding consultations, a similar talk was going on between the 3 captains of the privateers, and the conclusion they arrived at was precisely similar to that of the English officers. It was agreed that no attack was likely to be made by the ships, as they would almost certainly be sunk by the plunging fire of the battery as they came along the channel, while an assault by the boats would be sheer madness. "We have only to wait and tire them out," the captain of the schooner said, rubbing his hands. "The first gale from the north they must run for shelter, and before they can come back to their station again we shall be gone. Of course we will load well up beforehand with all that is really worth taking away, and can let them have the pleasure of destroying the rest after we have gone." "They will know all that as well as we do," the captain of La Belle Marie said. "They will never be fools enough to try and starve us out, but you are quite mistaken if you think we are out of danger." "Why, what danger can there be?" the other asked. "We have agreed they cannot attack us by the channel." "No, they cannot attack us from the channel, but they can attack us from somewhere else. Now they know we are here, they will find some place where they can land and take us in the rear." An exclamation of dismay broke from the other captains. "Sapriste! I never thought of that. Of course they can. I have never examined the coast on the other side, but there must be places where they could land." "Yes, no doubt there are, and you may be quite sure that that is the course they will adopt. These English are slow, but they are not fools, and I will bet 10 to 1 that that is the next move they will be up to. If you like, I will take a score of my men and cross the islands this afternoon, and tomorrow will examine the whole line of shore. If there are only 1 or 2 places they can land, we may be able to defend them. But if there are 4 or 5 places far apart, our force won't be sufficient to hold them all, for they could land 250 men from those 2 ships. Who knows, perhaps 100 more." "That is the best thing to be done, Vipon. Of course you will send us word across directly you see how the land lies. If we find that they can land in a good many places, there will be nothing for us to do but try and make a bolt for it. Keeping close in under the cliffs at night we may manage to give them the slip, or in any case 1 if not 2 of us may get away. Better that than to run the risk of being all caught like rats in a trap here." An hour afterward the captain of the Belle Marie started for the other side of the island with 20 picked men, carrying with them their arms, axes, and 2 days' provisions. The rest of the crews were employed during the day in filling up the 3 vessels with the most valuable portion of the booty in the storehouses, care being taken not to fill the vessels so deeply as would interfere seriously with their sailing powers. An arrangement had been made between the captains that the Belle Marie should transfer her cargo to the first vessel worth sending to France that she captured, receiving as her share 1/3 of its value if it reached port safely. The captain of the Belle Marie was well content with this arrangement, for the storehouses contained the spoils of upwards of 20 ships, and his share would therefore be a considerable one, and he would only have to carry the cargo till he fell in with an English merchantman. All speculation as to the British schooner's whereabouts was put to an end to the next morning by a message from Captain Vipon saying she had been discovered lying close in under the cliffs at the back of the island, and that her boats were already examining the shore. An hour later the captain himself arrived. "It is as I feared," he said when he joined the other captains. "There are 3 bays about 2 miles apart, and at all of these a landing could be easily effected. The land slopes gradually down to the edge of the sea. They might land at any of them, and of course the guns of the schooner would cover the landing if we opposed it." "Still we might beat them back," one of the others said. "We can muster about 300 men between us, and they are not likely to land more than that." "I don't think that would be a good plan," Captain Vipon said. "To begin with, we can't tell which of the 3 places they may choose for landing at. We certainly cannot hurry through the woods anything like so fast as they can row along the shore, so that would place us at a disadvantage. In the second place, you know very well that we can't rely upon our men defeating an equal number of these Jean Bulls. And in the last place, we should not gain much if we did. We should lose a tremendous lot of our men, and the schooner would go off and fetch 2 or 3 more ships of war here, so that in the end they must beat us. I think that there is no question that it will be better for us to take our chances of escape now. Either the schooner will come back tonight and tow the boats of the frigate round the other side of the island, or she will send a boat with the news that she has found the landing place, and then the frigate will send all her boats. I don't think the attack will take place tonight, but it may be made. It certainly won't if the schooner comes round, for the wind is very light. She will not leave her anchorage until it is quite dark, and by the time she has got round to the frigate and the boats' crews are ready to start, and they all get to the back of the island, it will be morning. If they send a boat, it would reach the frigate after 3 hours rowing. Give them an hour to get ready and start, and 3 hours to row back, so that brings it to nearly the same thing. Besides, I don't suppose in any case they would land before morning, for they would run the risk of losing their way in the woods. So my proposal is that about 2 o'clock in the morning we make a start, separate as soon as we get out of the harbor, and each shift for himself. The frigate will have more than half her crew away, and being so short-handed will not be so smart with her sails, and will not be able to work half her guns, so that at the outside 2 out of the 3 of us ought to get safely off." "But suppose that the schooner happens to be round here, and they make up their minds to wait a day before attacking, we should have 2 of them after us then, and that schooner sails like a witch." "I have thought of that," Captain Vipon said. "My idea is to put a man on the top of the cliff just above where the schooner is anchored. If she is lying there, he is to light a fire a short distance back from the edge of the cliff. There should be another man on the top of the hill. When he sees the fire he shall show a lantern 3 times. He will return the signal to let him know that we see it. If the schooner goes away early in the evening, the lookout is not to light the fire until he sees her returning, at whatever hour it may be. The moment we see the light we will set sail." "But how about the 2 signallers?" one of the other captains said. "They would be left behind and might not get the chance of rejoining us again." "I have thought of that too," Captain Vipon said. "I have an English lad on board whom I picked up in the Channel. He's a smart lad, and has been working as one of the crew. He would, of course, be glad to stay behind, because it will give him the chance of rejoining his friends." "Well, that would do capitally. But how about the other man? You see, if he showed himself he would be made prisoner and sent to England. If he didn't show himself he might be on this island for years before he got a chance of joining a French ship. It would need a high bribe to induce anybody to run such a risk as that." This was so evident that there was silence for 2 or 3 minutes. Then Captain Vipon spoke again. "I have a man who would be more likely to do it than anyone else, I think, because he has taken a strong fancy to this young English boy. He is a good hand, and I don't like losing him. Still, the thing is so important that I should not hesitate at that. Still, we must offer him something good to run the risk, or rather the certainty of imprisonment. I propose that his name shall be put down on the books of all 3 ships, so that if he ever gets back to France again he will have a fair certainty of a good lot of prize money, for it will be hard luck if 2 out of the 3 of us do not manage to get back safely." The other captains agreed to this. "He will be here in half an hour," Captain Vipon said. "The men were sitting down to a meal when I came away, and I ordered them to make their way back as soon as they had done. If he refuses, the only other way I can see will be for all the men to cast lots, when of course whoever stays would get his 3 shares, just as we agreed." Half an hour later the 20 men arrived from the other side of the island. As soon as they came on board, Captain Vipon called Jacques into the cabin and told him that it would be necessary to leave 2 men behind, explaining the duties they would have to perform. "Now, Jacques," he said when he had finished, "I thought that perhaps you would be more likely than any other man on board the 3 ships to volunteer for this work." "I volunteer?" Jacques said in astonishment. "What should make you think of such a thing, Captain?" "For this reason, Jacques. I have settled to leave the English lad here as one of the signallers. Of course he will be glad to undertake the job, as it will enable him to join his friends when they land, and as you like him and as he likes you, he might be able to make things easy for you. In the second place, we have determined that the name of whoever stops shall be borne on the ship's books of all 3 vessels to the end of their cruise, so that there would be a good bit of money coming even if only 1 out of the 3 ships gets back, and enough to set you up for life if all 3 get back safely. Of course you may have a spell of imprisonment, but it is likely that 1 at least of the ships may be caught going out tonight, and if it happens to be ours you would get the prison without the prize money." "That is so," Jacques agreed. "If you give me half an hour to think it over I will give you an answer. It's come upon me sudden like. I will talk it over with the boy. I suppose I can tell him, Captain?" On regaining the deck Jacques looked about for Ralph. "Come and sit along with me out on the bowsprit, lad. I want to have a private talk with you." Somewhat surprised, Ralph followed his friend out onto the bowsprit. "Now, boy," he said, "I have got a bit of news to tell you that will be pleasant to you. That's the first thing. And the next is I want your advice. You are a sensible young chap, you are, although you are but a lad, and I should like to know what you think about it." "Well, what's the good news, Jacques?" "The good news is this. You are likely before this time tomorrow to be with your friends." Ralph gave such a start of delight that he nearly slipped off the bowsprit. "Well, how is that, Jacques? It seemed too good to be true." "This is the way of it," Jacques said. "The 3 vessels are all going to cut and run tonight. A schooner of yours is round the other side of the island, and we want to be sure she is stopping there. Then there will be only the frigate to deal with, and in these light winds and dark nights we ought to be able to give her the slip. But the only way to be sure the schooner keeps the other side is to watch her. So 1 man is to be placed on the cliff above her, and at 2 o'clock in the morning, if she is still there, he is to light a fire well back from the cliff, so that the light will not be seen by her. Another man is to be on the top of the hill, where we were together with a lantern. You see, we can just see the top of the hill from here. When he sees the fire he is to show a light 3 times. If he sees it answered here, he will know it's all right and his work is done. If not, of course he shows the lights again until it's answered. Now they are going to leave you as one of the 2 signallers, and of course all you will have to do will be to wait for a bit, and then come down and join your friends." "Oh, that is capital," Ralph said. "Nothing could be better. Now, what is the other matter that you want my advice about, Jacques?" "Well, you see, it will be awkward for the other man, for he will either have the choice of coming down and giving himself up and being carried off as a prisoner, or of stopping on this island perhaps for years till a French ship happens to come along. For once off, the Marie will continue her cruise to the Indian seas, and the other 2 will make straight for France. Of course there is another course which might be taken, A boat might be hidden away for him, and he might go for a cruise on his own account and take the chance of being picked up. Well, they have offered to the man as stops to put his name down on the books of all 3 craft. That means, of course, that he will get a share in the prize money of all 3 ships if they get back. That's a pretty good offer, you know. You see, a fellow on board may get captured or killed in battle or wrecked, and in that case there would not be a penny of prize money. The man who stops here is sure of prize money if only one of the 3 craft get back to France. Now, they ask me if I will undertake it. I should be better off than the others, because in the first place I shall have you to talk with till I get to prison, and in the next place, as I can talk English, I can get on a good deal better in prison than other fellows would do. Now, what's your advice, lad?" "I should say certainly accept the offer, Jacques. You see, I can tell them all what a good friend you have been to me, and it may be that they'll let you go free. But even if they don't, I could make it pleasant for you with the men, and you may be sure that if they take you to an English prison, I'll do all I can to get you out of it. You see, when you get back to France, you would have really a good sum coming to you from these 3 ships. The 2 that have been out here have collected a tremendous lot of valuable plunder, and the Belle Marie is likely to get quite as much if, as you say, she is going to spend 2 years out in the Indian seas. So I really think you would be wise to take the offer. Another thing, if you like, I will not show myself at all, but will stop here with you, and we will take a boat together and make for some port, where we can give out that we are shipwrecked sailors." "No, lads, that wouldn't do, though I thank you for your offer. You might get a ship back to England, but I should have very little chance of getting one for France." "No, but we might get one together for America, and from there you might get to France easily enough." Jacques thought for some minutes. "No, lad, I will give myself up with you. We might get lost in a boat, seeing that neither of us knows the geography of these seas. We might get short of water or caught in a hurricane. No, I will give myself up. I know the worst that way, anyway. Another spell in an English prison, but from that I may either get exchanged or escape, or the war come to an end. So that's the best thing for me to do." Chapter 6. Home Again. Having decided to stay as one of the signallers, Jacques proceeded at once to the captain's cabin. "I am glad you have decided so, Jacques. It would have been a troublesome business to cast lots, and some of the men might have absolutely refused doing so, so I am glad it's settled. I have arranged with the other captains that you should have an advance of 20 Napoleons. You had best hide them about you. You may find them come in useful. The boy is to have 10. Of course he is glad of the chance, but at the same time he is doing us good service, and he has worked well since he came on board. It will help him to get a passage home." "Thank you, Captain. That 20 Napoleons may help me to get out of an English prison. I will manage a hiding place for them. And now I think, Captain, we will be off at once, at least as soon as we have had our dinner. It's a good long way across the island to where the schooner was lying, and I shall have to choose a place for my fire so it can be seen from the top of the hill." At dinner Jacques told his comrades that he was going to remain behind and act as signalman for them. A good deal of regret was expressed by his shipmates, many of whom came, like himself, from Dunkirk, and had known him from a boy. Before starting he went to the sailmaker and got him to open the soles of his shoes. He then inserted 10 Napoleons in each, and the sailmaker sewed them up again. Then, making his clothes into a kit, and getting a couple of bottles of wine from the steward, he shook hands with his messmates, and was with Ralph rowed ashore. On landing they cut 2 sticks and hung their kits upon these, Ralph taking charge of the lantern, while both were provided with tinder and steel. They walked for half a mile together, and then Jacques said: "Here our paths separate, lad. You can't miss your way to the top of the hill. I go almost the other way, for the schooner lies but a short distance from the end of the island. If I were you I should lie up for a sleep as soon as I get there. Remember, you will not see my fire till 2 o'clock. If you do not see it, then you must keep watch till morning, for there is no saying when it may be lit. As soon as you see it, you show a light 3 times in the direction of the creek. If you see it answered, you will have nothing more to do. If not, you must keep on showing the light till you do get an answer. In the morning you wait till the sun has been up an hour, then come to this spot and wait for me. I shall start at daybreak, but I have a lot further to walk than you have, so I shan't be there before you. If we find your people haven't come into the harbour, we will wait till they do so. Then, when they find that there is no one there, we can show ourselves quietly. But if we got there first, they might begin to shoot directly they saw us without stopping to ask any questions." Ralph made his way up to the top of the hill, threw himself down under some trees near the summit, and was soon fast asleep. When he awoke it was already dark. He lit his lantern, covered it up with his jacket, and took his station at the highest point. He had plenty to think about. Another 12 hours and he would be with friends. He had no reason to complain of the treatment he had received on board the privateer, but had he remained with her he might not have returned to France for a couple of years, and would then have had difficulty in crossing to England. Besides, it was painful for him to be with men fighting against his country, and each prize taken, instead of causing delight to him as to his comrades, would have been a source of pain. But most of all he thought of his mother, of how she must have grieved for him as dead, and of the joy there would be at their reunion. The hours therefore passed quickly, and he could scarcely believe it to be 2 o'clock when he suddenly saw the light of a fire far away toward the end of the island. A glance at the stars showed him that the time was correct. He rose to his feet, and taking the lantern held it aloft. Then he lowered it behind a bush, and twice raised it again. He knew exactly the direction in which the harbour lay, and no sooner had he put down the lantern for the third time than 3 flashes of light followed in close succession. He knew that everything would be prepared in the afternoon for the start. Orders had been issued before he left that the oars of the boats were to be muffled, and that the chains at the entrance of the channel were to be removed, and the ships got in a position with shortened cables for a start. He could picture to himself, as he stood there gazing into the darkness, that the men would be already in the boats awaiting his signal, and as soon as it was seen they would begin to tow the vessels out of the harbour. During the daytime the frigate cruised back and forward under easy sail some 2 miles off the entrance, but the sailors believed that at night she came very much closer to the shore, the lookout with night glasses having reported that she had been seen once or twice within a quarter of a mile of the entrance to the channel. Half an hour passed without any sign that the frigate was aware that the ships were leaving the harbour. Then Ralph heard the sound of a distant musket shot, followed by several others, and had no doubt that one of the frigate's boats on watch near the channel had in fact discovered them. A few minutes later there was a flash some distance out at sea, followed after an interval by the deep boom of a gun. Then came a broadside, followed by a steady fire of heavy guns. These were evidently fired on board the frigate, no answering sounds from the French ships meeting his ear. He could see by the direction of the flashes that the frigate was under way. The firing continued for 2 hours, becoming more and more distant, and then it ceased altogether. When the sun rose he saw the frigate some 20 miles away. There was a smaller craft 2 or 3 miles further off, and 2 others were visible 10 or 12 miles further away to the west. 2 of the privateers had evidently made their escape, and the third seemed to be leaving her pursuer behind, for the wind was exceedingly light. Some miles nearer to the island than the frigate a schooner was visible. She was heading for the 2 vessels that had gone toward the west, but as these were fully 15 miles to windward her chances of overtaking them appeared to be slight. Ralph waited an hour, then proceeded at a leisurely pace toward the spot where he was to meet Jacques. He was but 5 minutes at the spot agreed upon when he saw Jacques coming through the trees. "I heard nothing of the landing parties," he said, as the French sailor approached. "The reason is not far to search for. They did not land at all," he replied. "And I did not much expect that they would. The boats from the frigate arrived a few minutes before I lighted my fire. I was lying down at the edge of the cliff, looking right down upon her deck. They came up in a body, rowing with muffled oars. I could just hear the sound of their talking when they came on deck. As soon as I had the fire fairly alight I saw your signal, and then went back to watch them. Everything was quiet till I heard the boom of the first gun. Then I heard 'Silence!' ordered on the schooner. I suppose someone had said that he heard a gun and others didn't. Of course the sound did not come to them under the shelter of the cliff as it did to me. Then came the sound of another gun, and then 3 or 4 close together. Then orders were given sharply, the capstan was manned and the anchor run up, and they were not a minute getting her sails set. But under the shelter of the cliff there was not enough wind to fill them, and so the boats were manned, and she went gliding away until I could no longer make her out. They guessed, of course, that our craft were making off, and went to help the frigate." "They were too late to be of any use, Jacques." "Ah, you have seen them from the top of the hill. I did not think of that. What is the news?" "The frigate was in chase of one of them. It was too far for me to see which. I should say he was 2 or 3 miles ahead, certainly well out of gunshot, and as far as I could see during the hour I was watching them was increasing her lead. Unless the wind freshens I think she is safe. The other 2 were on the opposite tack, 10 or 12 miles away to the west. The schooner was heading after them, but was at least 15 miles from them. She is very fast in a light wind like this, they say." Well, if she should catch them, they ought to be able to beat her off, Jacques, as they are 2 to 1. So far, I think your chance of getting your 3 shares is a good one." "Maybe, lad. I have not had much luck so far. I began on the sea when I was 11. At 21 I had to go into the navy, and it was 7 years later when I got back to Dunkirk after that spell in the prison. I did not report myself, for I had no wish to do any more man of war's work, and now I have had 6 years' privateer's work, and have not made much by it. If I get back this time and get those 3 shares, I will buy a fine fishing smack for myself and a snug little house on shore. There is someone I promised, if the voyage turned out well, she should have a nice little house of her own, and she promised to wait for me. After that, no more long voyages for me. I suppose we may as well go down to the harbour now, lad. They are sure to come back sooner or later, whether they catch any of the privateers or not." "Oh, yes. We shall be all safe now. We will be on the beach when they come in. When they see that we are alone and unarmed, there is no chance of their firing. We can go up occasionally to the cliffs and watch for them." It was not until the following evening that the frigate was seen approaching the island. "She will take another 4 or 5 hours to work in," Jacques said, "and they are not likely to try to land till tomorrow morning. All their boats and half their men are away in the schooner. I should think she would be back tomorrow morning. Either she caught them before it got dark last night, which I don't think likely, or they will have given her the slip in the night. In that case she might look about for another day, and then make sail to rejoin." As Jacques predicted, the schooner was seen by daylight 8 or 10 miles away. "We may as well hoist a white flag, Jacques. The captain of the frigate will be savage that all the privateers have escaped him, but it may put him into a good humour if he takes possession here before the schooner arrives." Ralph ran down to the storehouse, got hold of a sheet and an oar, and a white flag was soon hoisted on the top of the cliff. 5 minutes later 2 gigs were seen rowing off from the frigate. Ralph and Jacques took their places on the battery. When the boats reached the mouth of the narrow entrance, the order was given for the men to lay on their oars. Ralph shouted at the top of his voice, "You can come on in, sir. We are the only 2 here." The order was given to row on, and Ralph and his companion at once went down to meet them at the end of the harbour. The captain himself was in the stern of his own gig, while a young lieutenant held the lines in the other boat. "Who are you?" the captain asked as he stepped ashore on the little wharf. "You are English by your speech." "I am English, sir. I was on board a fishing boat in the channel when we were run down by one of those privateers in the dark. I believe the fisherman with me was drowned, but I clung to the bobstay and was got on board. She was on her way out here, and I had no opportunity of landing, so she only arrived here 2 days before you came up." "You are not a fisherman?" the captain said abruptly. "No, sir. My mother is living in Dover, and I was at school there. I lost my father, who was an architect, some years ago." "And who is this who is with you?" "He is a sailor in the brig I came out in, and has been extremely kind to me during the voyage, and kept the others from persecuting me." "How is it he is left behind?" the captain asked. "He was round the other side of the island watching the schooner," Ralph replied, "and the others sailed away without him," for Ralph had agreed with Jacques that it was better to say nothing about the signalling. "Have you done any fighting since you were on board the privateer?" the captain asked sternly. "No, sir. We have only exchanged shots with one ship since we sailed. She fired one broadside, and the privateer drew off a good deal damaged. Another was surprised by night, but I took no part in it. I don't know what she was laden with, or what was her name." "Well, lad, your story sounds truthful, and will of course be inquired into when we get to England. As to this man, he is of course a prisoner." "Oh, I hope not, sir," Ralph pleaded. "He is not taken with arms in his hands, and he is in fact a castaway mariner." The captain's face relaxed into a smile. "Well, I see you are a sort of a sea lawyer. Well, we shall see about it. What is there in these storehouses?" "Oh, a quantity of things, sir. They took away a great many with them, but there must be 10 times as much left. I heard them say they had the cargoes of more than 20 ships here." "Well, that is satisfactory at any rate," the captain said. "Mr. Wilde, will you just take a look round those storehouses and see what there is worth taking away? You had better take my boat's crew as well as your own to help you turn things over. Are you quite sure, lad, that there is no one besides yourselves on the island?" "Oh, I can't say that, sir. The orders were for all hands to embark last night, and so far as I know none of them were left behind except Jacques Clery. We have been here for 2 days now and have seen no one, so I do not think anyone else can have been left behind." "How did you get on board the brig?" the captain asked. I suppose you cannot speak French." "Oh, I couldn't speak any French when I first got on board, sir, but I picked up a good deal on the voyage out. Jacques speaks English very well. He was a prisoner in England for 3 years and learned it there, and it was that which caused him to speak to me directly he got me on board, for no one else understood me. So he set to work at once to help me in my French, so that I could get along. The captain was very kind too. He said that as I had been picked up in that way he should not treat me as a prisoner, but he expected me to make myself useful, and of course I did so. It was the only way of having a comfortable life." "Is this the only place the privateers had on shore here?" the captain asked, looking round. "I only see 1 or 2 huts." "The storekeepers lived in them, sir. They stopped behind to look after things when the privateers were away. The men slept on board their vessels, only landing to disembark the cargoes they had captured, and for a drunken spree when they first returned. I am sure they have had no other place." "So your brig only arrived here 4 days ago? I was puzzled in the morning when I saw that there were 2 brigs and a schooner, when we had only expected 1 brig. Of course your arrival accounts for that. What was her name, and how many guns and men did she carry?" "She was La Belle Marie of Dunkirk," Ralph replied. "She carried 14 guns, mostly 18-pounders, and a 32-pounder on a pivot. She had 80 hands at first, but 8 of them went away in the prize." "Do you know whether she has gone off straight for France, or whether she is going to remain here?" "From what I gathered from the men, sir, I believe that the other 2 privateers are going straight home. They loaded up from the storehouses, taking of course the most valuable stuff. There was a great deal of copper, but what the rest was I do not know. Our brig was loaded up too, but I believe her intention was to transfer her cargo into the first prize she took and send it to France. I do not know whether she was going to cruise about here for a time, but I should rather think that now that her consorts have gone and this place been discovered she will not stay here, for she never intended to cruise in these waters long. I know that her destination was the Indian Ocean, and she intended to capture Indiamen on their way out or home." "In that case our expedition has been more satisfactory than I expected," the captain said. "We shall have discovered and destroyed their depot here, captured anyhow some valuable stuff, and caused the 2 privateers that we have been hunting for so long to leave the islands, to say nothing of this brig of yours, of which we had not heard. Well, Mr. Wilde, what's your report? It will take a long time to go through the whole, sir, but I should say that we have taken a most valuable prize. Part of the goods consist of a produce of these parts, puncheons of rum and hogsheads of sugar in any number. Then I see they have left a good many tons of copper behind them, overlooked them, I suppose, in the hurry of loading. A considerable portion of the stores consist of home produce, cottons, cloths, silks, furniture, musical instruments, mirrors, and in fact goods of all kinds." "Oh, that is most satisfactory, Mr. Wilde, and we shan't have our trouble for nothing. Ah, here come the other boats." As he spoke the pinnaces, longboats, and cutters of the 2 ships of war dashed into the harbour, and in a minute or 2 reached the landing place. "So they gave you the slip as well as me, Chambers?" Captain Wilson said. "Confound them, yes. I was within about 4 miles of them at sunset, but they both gave me the slip in the dark." "Well, mine fairly outsailed me," Captain Wilson said. "I'm afraid we've made rather a mess of the affair, though we acted for the best, and I don't see how we could have done otherwise. However, I've learned that the brig and the schooner we've been chasing so long have made straight for France, so that we shall have no more trouble with them. The other brig, which only arrived 2 days before we chased the others in here, has, it is believed, also gone off, so we shan't have done so badly, for we can report that we have found out and destroyed their nest here, and I fancy from what my lieutenant says we've made a very valuable capture, enough to give us a round sum in prize money." "Well, that will be some consolation," the other laughed, "for I would give my share of it if I could have but come up with and engaged those rascally craft I've been hunting all over the islands for these last 2 years. Whom have we got here? 2 prisoners?" "Well, I hardly know whether they can be called prisoners. One is an English lad who was in a boat they ran down in the channel, and who, I dare say, they were glad to get rid of. It seems that he's a gentleman's son, and his story is clear enough. The other belongs to the brig I chased, which, it seems, only arrived here 2 days ago. The young fellow says that he's been particularly kind to him, and has begged me to regard him in the light of a castaway sailor, seeing that he was found here unarmed and away from his ship. And I think there is something in his plea, as there is no credit or glory to obtain from handing over 1 prisoner. I consider that under the circumstances we'll be justified in letting him go ashore quietly, and in saying nothing about it. At one time the man was a prisoner of war in England, and has picked up our language, so I dare say he'll be able to manage to find his way home without too much difficulty." "What are you thinking of doing with all this stuff?" Captain Chambers asked, pointing to the storehouses. "Oh, I think we'd better take it away with us. I don't like turning the Alert into a store ship, but it would be better to do that than to have the expense of chartering 2 or 3 ships to come here and fetch it away. Besides, if I did that, you'd have to stop here until it's all carried away, and to burn the storehouses afterward." "Oh, then by all means let us load up," Captain Chambers said. "I certainly have no wish to be kept here for 6 weeks or a couple of months. I'll go out and bring the Seagull in at once." "The sooner the better, Chambers. I'll set a couple of boats at work at once to take soundings here and in the Channel. If I can get the Alert in, I will. It would save a lot of trouble and time." It was found that the channel and the harbour inside contained an abundance of water for the frigate. The width between the rocks was, however, only just sufficient to let her through, and therefore, while the schooner sailed boldly in, the frigate was towed in by her boats. The next morning the work of shipping the contents of the storehouses commenced, but so large was the quantity of goods stored up that it took 6 days of hard work before all was safely on board. The sailors, however, did not grudge the work, for they knew that every box and bale meant so much prize money. "I hope we shall meet nothing we ought to chase on our way to Port Royal," Captain Wilson said, looking with some disgust at the 2 vessels. "It's brought the Alert nearly 2 feet lower in the water, while as to the Seagull, she's laden down like a collier." "Yes, her wings are clipped for the present," Captain Chambers replied. "Of course those rascals carried off the pick of their booty with them, but we may be well content with what they left behind. It will be the best haul that we've made for some years. As a rule, the most we have to hope for is the money fetched by the sale of any privateer we may catch, and they generally go for next to nothing. Oh, I retract what I said, that I would give my share of the prize money to come up with the privateers. I certainly never calculated on such a haul as this. I suppose they intended to have gone on storing away their booty till the war came to an end, and then to have chartered a dozen ships to carry it away." Captain Wilson had introduced Ralph to the midshipmen, telling them that he would be in their mess till he reached port. He was soon at home among them, and his clothes were replaced by some they lent him. Jacques made himself equally at home among the crew. Captain Wilson had intimated to the first lieutenant that the man was not to be considered as a prisoner, but as a castaway picked up on the island, and from his cheery temper, his willingness to lend a hand and make himself useful in any way, and his knowledge of their language, he was soon a favourite with them. When all the goods were on board, fire was applied to the storehouses and huts. The 2 vessels were then towed out of the harbour, and hoisting sail made for Port Royal. The winds were light, and it was 6 days before they entered the harbour. A signal was at once hoisted from the flagship there for the captain to come on board. "I have no doubt he is in a towering rage at our appearance," Captain Wilson said to the first lieutenant, "but I fancy he will change his tone pretty quickly when he learns what we have got on board. His share of the prize money will come to a pretty penny." The next morning a number of lighters came alongside the ships, and the work of discharging the cargo commenced. After breakfast Ralph and Jacques were rowed ashore. "You'll want some money to pay for your passage, young gentlemen," Captain Wilson said to Ralph before leaving the ship. "I'll authorize you to tell an agent that I'll be security for the payment of your passage money." "Oh, I'm very much obliged to you, sir," Ralph replied, "but I shall work my way home if I can. I have learned to be pretty handy on board the privateer, and I would as lief be working forward as dawdling about aft all the way home. Besides, I really don't want to inconvenience my mother by her being called upon suddenly to pay £30 or £40 directly I get home. I've caused her trouble enough as it is." "That's right, my lad," the captain said. "I like your spirit. Have you money enough to pay for your hotel expenses while you are waiting for a ship?" "Yes, thank you, sir. The French captain said I had fairly earned wages, and gave me 10 napoleons when he started." "He must have been a good sort of fellow, though I wish we had caught him for all that. Well, goodbye, and a pleasant voyage home." Ralph put up at a quiet boarding house kept by a mulatto woman. He and Jacques got a fresh rig out of clothes at once, and went down to the port to inquire about ships. Ralph was greatly amused at the aspect of the streets, crowded with chattering negroes and negresses in gaudy colours. The outlay of a few pence purchased an almost unlimited supply of fruit, and Ralph and his companion sat down on a log of wood by the wharves and enjoyed a feast of pineapples, bananas, and custard apples. Then they set about their work. In an hour both were suited. Jacques Clery shipped as a foremast hand on board an American trading schooner, which was about to return to New York, while Ralph obtained a berth before the mast in a fine bark that would sail for England in a few days. Next morning they said goodbye to each other, for Jacques had to go on board after breakfast. They made many promises to see each other again when the war came to an end. "I shall never forget your kindness, Jacques, and if I'm still at Dover when peace is proclaimed, I'll run over to Dunkirk by the very first vessel that sails." "As for the kindness, it is nothing," Jacques replied. "And beside that, you saved my life from that snake. I dream sometimes of that beast still, and it was really owing to you that I am here now, and that I shall get a round sum coming to me when I return home. If it hadn't have been for you, I should not have been chosen to stop behind and get 3 shares instead of 1 of the prize money. And in the next place, it is your doing that I am free to start at once, and to make my way back as soon as I can, and spending 4 or 5 years, it may be, in an English prison. Why, my Louise will be ready to jump for joy when she sees me arrive, instead of having to wait another 2 years for me, with the chance of my never coming back at all. And she will hardly believe me when I tell her that I shall be able to afford to buy that fishing boat and set up in a house of our own at once, and she will be most surprised of all when I tell her that it is all owing to an English boy I fished on board on a dark night in the Channel. Well, Jacques, we won't dispute as to which owes the other most. Anyway, except for my mother, I'm not sorry I've made the trip in the Belle Marie. I have seen a lot of life, and have had a rare adventure, and I have learned so much of sailor's work that if I am ever driven to it, I can work my way anywhere before the mast in future." Ralph went on board his own ship as soon as he had seen Jacques off, and was soon hard at work assisting to hoist on board hogsheads of sugar and other produce. He was startled by the sound of a heavy gun. It was answered presently by all the ships of war in the harbour and by the forts on shore, and for 5 minutes the heavy cannonade continued. The captain, who had been on shore, crossed the gangway onto the ship as the crew were gazing in surprise at the cannonade, exchanging guesses as to its cause. "I have great news, lads," he said. "Peace is proclaimed, and Napoleon has surrendered and is to be shut up in the island of Elba in the Mediterranean. No more fear of privateers or French prisons." The crew burst into a hearty cheer. This was indeed surprising news. It was known that Wellington was gradually driving back the French marshals in the south of France, and that the allies were marching towards Paris, but Napoleon had been so long regarded as invincible that no one had really believed that his downfall was imminent. 4 days later the cargo was all on board, and the Fanny sailed for England. The voyage was accomplished without adventure. As soon as the vessel entered dock and the crew were discharged, Ralph landed, and having purchased a suit of landsman's clothes, presented his kit to a lad of about his own age who had been his special chum on board the Fanny, and then made his way to the inn from which the coaches for Dover started. Having secured a place for next day, dined, and of course ordered a bed, he passed the evening strolling along the streets of London, and next morning at 6 o'clock took his place in the coach. "Going back from school, I suppose, young gentleman?" a military-looking man seated next to him in the coach remarked, as soon as they had left the streets behind them and were rattling along the old Kent road. "No, I'm not going home from school," Ralph said with a smile. "At least not from the sort of school you mean, though I've been learning a good deal too. I arrived yesterday from the West Indies." "Indeed," the gentleman said, scrutinizing him closely. "I see you look sunburned and weather-beaten now that I look at you, but somehow I should not have put you down as a sailor." "Well, I'm not exactly a sailor, though I may say I have worked as one before the mast, both out and home. That was my first experience, and I suppose one takes longer than that to get the regular nautical manner." "Before the mast, were you? Well, then I suppose you've been getting into some scrape at home, young sir, and run away, for from your appearance you'd hardly have been before the mast otherwise. Boys never know what is good for them, but I suppose after your experience you'll be inclined to put up with any disagreeables you may have at home rather than trying to run away again." "You are mistaken," Ralph said with a laugh. "I did not run away. I was run away with." "Kidnapped?" the gentleman said in surprise. "I know that merchantmen have often difficulty in getting hands owing to the need of men for the navy, but I didn't know that they'd taken to press gangs on their own account." "No, I don't know that they've come to that," Ralph replied. "The fact is, sir, I was out fishing a few miles off Dover when the smack I was in was run down in the dock by a French privateer. I was hauled on board, and as she was bound for the West Indies I had to make the voyage whether I liked it or not." "How long ago is it that you were run down?" "About 5 months," Ralph replied. "Why, you're not the son of Mrs. Conway of Dover, are you?" "Yes, I am, sir. Do you know her, and can you tell me how she is?" Ralph asked eagerly. "Oh, I believe that she is well, although of course she must have suffered very greatly at your disappearance. I haven't the pleasure of knowing her personally, but several friends of mine are acquainted with her. I heard the matter talked about at the time the boat was missing. Some portions of her were picked up by other fishing boats, and by the shattered state of some of the planks they said she had been run down. Besides, There had been no wind about the time she disappeared, so that there was little doubt some vessel or other had cut her down. I happened to hear of it from Colonel Bryant, who is a friend of your mother." "Yes, I know him," Ralph put in. "I have heard Colonel Bryant say that she has not altogether abandoned hope, and still clings to the idea that you may have been run down by some outward bound ship, and that you had been saved and carried away, and that she declares that she will not give up all hope until ample time has elapsed for a ship to make the voyage to India and return." "Oh, I am very glad of that," Ralph said. "It has been a great trouble to me that she would be thinking all this time that I was dead. I should not have minded having been carried away so much if I had had a chance of writing to her to tell her about it, but I never did have a chance, for I came home by the very first ship that left Port Royal after I arrived here." "How did you get away from the French privateer? Was she captured?" "Well, it's rather a long story, sir," Ralph said modestly. "All the better," the gentleman replied. "We've got 14 hours' journey before us, and your story will certainly help pass the time. So don't try to cut it short, but let me have it in full." Ralph thereupon told the story, which lasted until the coach reached Tunbridge, where it stopped for the passengers to dine. "Well, that is an adventure worth going through," the officer, who had already mentioned his name was Major Barlow, said. "And it was well for you, lad, that you possessed a good spirit and courage. A man who is cheerful and willing under difficulties will always make his way in the world, while one who repines and kicks against his fate only makes it harder for him. I have no doubt that if, instead of taking matters coolly when you found yourself on board the privateer, you had fretted and grumbled, you would have been made a drudge and kicked and cuffed by everyone on board. You would not have had a chance of landing at the island or of being chosen to take the signal when they went away, and you would now be leading the life of a dog on board that brig. Cheerful and willing are two of the great watchwords of success in life, and certainly you have found it so." It was 8 o'clock when the coach rattled up the streets of Dover. Major Barlow had already offered Ralph to take him to Colonel Bryant's quarters, and to ask the colonel to go with him to call on Mrs. Conway and prepare her for Ralph's coming. Chapter 7. A Commission. Colonel Bryant was just rising from dinner at the mess when Major Barlow and Ralph arrived at the barracks, and after congratulating the lad on his return, he willingly agreed to accompany them to Mrs. Conway. A quarter of an hour's walk took them to her house. Ralph remained outside when the two officers entered. Colonel Bryant lost no time in opening the subject. "I have brought my friend Major Barlow to introduce to you, Mrs. Conway, because he has happened to hear some news that may, I think, bear upon the subject that you have most at heart." "Ralph!" Mrs. Conway exclaimed, clasping her hands. "We think it may refer to your son, Mrs. Conway," Major Barlow said. "I have just returned from town, and happened to hear that a vessel had been spoken with that reported having picked up a lad from a smack run down in the Channel some 5 months ago, which corresponds pretty well, I think, with the time your son was missing." "Just the time," Mrs. Conway said. Did they not say the name?" "Well, yes. The name, as far as I heard it, for as I had not the pleasure of knowing you, I was not, of course, so interested in the matter, was the same as yours." "Oh, I think that there is no doubt about it, Mrs. Conway," Colonel Bryant said, kindly. "I consider you may quite set your mind at ease, for I have no doubt whatever it's your son who's been picked up." Mrs. Conway was so much overcome that she sank into a chair and sat for a short time with her face in her hand, crying happy tears, and thanking God for his mercy. Then, with a great effort, she aroused herself. "You will excuse my emotion, gentlemen, and I am sure you can understand my feelings. I am thankful indeed for the news you have brought me. I have never ceased for a moment to hope that my boy would be restored to me, for the knowledge that it is so, and that God has spared him to me, is for the moment overpowering." "And where was the ship met with, Major Barlow, and where was she bound for? How long do you think it is likely to be before Ralph comes home?" "Well, Mrs. Conway," Major Barlow said, hesitating a little, "the ship was bound for India, but I understand from what was said that the vessel that brought the news had also brought home the lad who had been carried away." "Well, then, in that case," Mrs. Conway cried, "he may be home in a day or two, perhaps," and she paused and looked from one to the other. "Yes, perhaps he is here already," Colonel Bryant said gently. "Yes, Mrs. Conway, if you feel equal to it, you may see him at once." No word was needed. Major Barlow opened the door, went through the hall, called Ralph, and in another moment the lad was clasped in his mother's arms, and the two officers, without another word, went quietly out and left them to themselves. It was some time before a coherent word could be spoken by mother or son, and it was not until they had knelt down together and returned thanks to God for Ralph's restoration that they were able to talk quietly of what had passed. Then Mrs. Conway poured out question after question, but Ralph refused to enter upon a narrative of his adventures. "It's a long story, mother, and we'll keep very well till tomorrow. It's past 9 o'clock now, and I'm sure that you want a night's rest after this excitement, and after 14 hours on a coach I shan't be sorry to be in bed myself. Besides, I want you to tell me first how you've been getting on while I've been away, and all the news about everyone, but even that will keep. I think, mother, a cup of tea first and then bed will be best for us both." The next morning Ralph related all his adventures to his mother, who was surprised indeed at his story. "I suppose poor old Joe was never heard of, mother?" "No, Ralph. His son has been up here a good many times to inquire if we had any news of you. He's gone into another fishing boat now, and his sister has gone out to service. Their mother died years ago, you know." "I was afraid that he'd gone straight down, mother. Nobody on board the brig heard any cry or shout for help. He must have been injured in the collision." "I must write today to Mr. Penfold. He has written to me several times, and has been most kind. He has all along said that he believed you would turn up one of these days, for as the weather was fine and the sea fairly calm when you were run down, the probabilities in favour of your being picked up were great, especially as you were such a good swimmer. I'm sure he will be delighted to hear of your return." "I hope he'll not be wanting me to go straight down there again," Ralph said ruefully. "I was only back with you one day, mother, after my visit to them, and now I've been 5 months away. It will be very hard if I am to be dragged off again." "Oh, I'm sure Mr. Penfold will not be so unreasonable as to want to take you away from me," Mrs. Conway said. "And am I to go back to school again, mother?" "Well, not now, certainly, Ralph. The holidays will be beginning in a fortnight again. Besides, you know we were talking anyhow of your leaving at the end of this half year." "That's right, mother. It's high time I was doing something for myself. Besides, after doing a man's work for the last 5 months, I wouldn't like to settle down to lessons again." "Well, we must think about it, Ralph. You know I consented greatly against my will to your choosing the army for your profession, and I'm not going to draw back from that. You're just 16 now, and although that is rather young, I believe that a good many lads do get their commissions somewhere about that age. In one of his letters Mr. Penfold said that as soon as you came back he'd take the matter in hand, and though I have good interest in other quarters and could probably manage it, Mr. Penfold has a great deal more than I have, and as he has expressed his willingness to arrange it, I shall be grateful to you for doing so." "Oh, that will be first rate, mother," Ralph said in delight. "I thought in another year I might get my commission, but of course it would be ever so much better to get it a year earlier." For the next few days Ralph was a hero among his boy friends, and had to tell his story so often that at last he told his mother that if it wasn't for leaving her so soon he should be quite ready to go off again for another visit to Mr. Penfold. "You won't be called upon to do that," she said smiling, "for this letter that I have just opened is from him, and he tells me he is coming here at once to see you, for he thinks it would be too hard to ask me to spare you again so soon." "You don't mean to say that he is coming all that way?" Ralph said in surprise. "Well, I am very glad." "He asks me in his letter," Mrs. Conway said with a passing smile of amusement, "if I can take in a young friend of his, Miss Mabel Withers. He says she has never been from home before, and that it would be a treat for her to get away and see a little of the world. He is going to stop a few days in London and show her the sights on his way back." "Oh, that will be very jolly, mother. You know I told you what a nice sort of girl she was, and how well we got on together. I don't know how I should have got through my visit there if it hadn't been for her. Her father and mother were very kind too, and I was often over at their house." Mr. Penfold had not succeeded in inducing Mr. and Mrs. Withers to allow Mabel to accompany him without much argument. "You know what I have set my mind on, Mrs. Withers," he said, "but of course such an idea doesn't enter the young people's heads. It would be very undesirable that it should do so. But now Ralph has returned he will be wanting to get his commission at once, and then he may be away on foreign service for years, and I do think it would be a good idea for the young people to see as much of each other as possible before he goes. If anything happens to me before he comes back, and you know how probable it is that this will be the case, they would meet almost as strangers, and I do not want to see my pet scheme at least on the way to be carried out before I go. It would be a treat for Mabel, and I am sure that Mrs. Conway will look after her well." "And how long are you thinking of stopping there, Mr. Penfold?" "Oh,
10 days or a fortnight. I shall be a day or two in town as I go through, for I want to arrange about Ralph's commission. Then perhaps I shall persuade Mrs. Conway to come up with Ralph to town with us, and to go about with the young people to see the sights. Now, if you and Mrs. Withers would join us there, that would be completely to my happiness." The clergyman and his wife both said that this was impossible, but Mr. Penfold urged his request with so much earnestness that at last they agreed to come up to town and stay with him at a hotel. And indeed, when they recovered from the first surprise at the proposal, both of them thought that the trip would be an extremely pleasant one, for in those days it was quite an event in the lives of people residing at a distance from a town to pay a visit to the metropolis. "Then everything is arranged delightfully," Mr. Penfold said. "This will be a holiday indeed for me, and however much you may all enjoy yourselves, I shall enjoy myself a great deal more. Now, I suppose I may tell Mabel of our arrangement?" "But you don't know that Mrs. Conway will take her in yet. Surely you are going to wait to hear from her?" "Indeed I am not, Mrs. Withers. I am as impatient as a schoolboy to be off, and I am perfectly certain that Mrs. Conway will be very glad to receive her. She knows Mabel, for I have given her an idea of my fancy about that matter, and of course she will be glad to learn something of your girl." "But she may not have a spare room," Mrs. Withers urged feebly. "Oh, it's not likely," Mr. Penfold said decisively, "and if there should be any difficulty on that score it will be very easily managed, as Ralph can give up his room to Mabel and come and stay at the hotel with me." Mr. Withers laughed. "I see that it is of no use raising objections, Penfold. You are armed at all points. I scarcely know you. You've certainly never seemed so possessed of such a spirit of determination." Mr. Penfold smiled. "It would have been better for me, perhaps, if I had always been so determined, Withers. At any rate, I mean to have my own way in this matter. I have not had a real holiday for years." So Mr. Penfold had his own way, and carried off Mabel wild with delight and excitement upon the day after he had received Mrs. Conway's letter. There was no shade of embarrassment in the meeting between Mrs. Conway and the man who had once been her lover. It was like two old and dear friends who had long been separated and now come together again. Mr. Penfold's first words after introducing Mabel had reference to Ralph. "Your boy has grown quite a man, Mary. In the last 6 months I scarcely recognized the bronzed young fellow who met us at the coach office as the lad who was down with me in the summer. Don't you see the change, Mabel?" "Yes, he is quite different," the girl said. "Why, the first time I saw him he was as shy could be. It was quite hard work getting on with him. Now he seems quite a man." "Oh, nothing like that yet, Mabel," Ralph protested. "Not a man!" Mr. Penfold exclaimed. "What! After wandering about as a pirate, capturing ships and cutting men's throats, for anything I know, and taking part in all sorts of atrocities? Why, I think he's entitled to think himself very much a man." Ralph laughed. "Oh, not as bad as that, Mr. Penfold. They did take one ship, but I had nothing to do with it, and there were no throats cut. I simply made a voyage out and back as a boy before the mast, and as far as I've been concerned the ship might have been a peaceful trader instead of a French privateer." "Well, Mary, you have not changed much all these years," Mr. Penfold said, turning to Mrs. Conway, while the two young people began to talk to each other. "I had thought you would be much more changed, but time has treated you much more kindly than it has me. You're 37, if I remember right, and you don't look 30. I am 40, and look at the very least 10 years older." Mrs. Conway did not contradict him, for she could not have done so with truth. "You are changed, Herbert, a great deal changed," she said sadly. "Although I should have known you anywhere, you are so much thinner than when I saw you last. But your eyes have not changed, nor your smile. Of course, your hair having got grey makes a difference, and she stopped. "I am changed altogether, Mary. I was a headstrong, impetuous young fellow then. I'm a fragile and broken man now. But I'm happy to meet you again, very happy in the thought that I can benefit your son. I have an interest in life now that I wanted before, and in spite of my being anxious about Ralph while he was away, have been happier for the last 6 months than I have been for 17 years past." Mrs. Conway turned away to conceal the tears that stood in her eyes, and a moment later said, "Oh, I am a most forgetful hostess, Mabel. I have not even asked you to take off your things. Please come along and let me show you your room. Supper will be ready in a minute or two, and here we are stopping and forgetting that you and Mr. Penfold must be almost famished." As soon as they sat down to supper, Mr. Penfold said, "By the way, Ralph, I have a piece of news for you. We stopped a couple of days, you know, in town, and I saw my friend at the Horse Guards and had a chat about you. He seemed to think that you would be better if you were a few months older, but as he acknowledged that many commissions had been given to lads under 16, and as you had just arrived at that age, and as I told him you had no end of experience with pirates and buccaneers and all that sort of thing, he was silenced, and your commission will appear in the next Gazette." "Oh, Mr. Penfold," Ralph exclaimed as he leaped from his seat in delight, "I am obliged to you. That is glorious. I hardly even hoped I could get a commission for some months to come. Don't look so sad, Mother," running round and kissing her. "I shan't be going out of England yet, you know, and now the war is over you need have no fear of my getting killed, and a few months sooner or later cannot make much difference." "Oh, I shall bear it in time, Ralph," his mother said, trying to smile through her tears, "but it comes as a shock just at first." The sight of his mother's tears sobered Ralph for a time, and during supper the conversation was chiefly supported by Mr. Penfold, who joked Ralph about his coming back in a few years a general without arms or legs, and was indeed so cheerful and lively that Mabel could scarcely believe her ears, so wholly unlike was he to the quiet friend she had known as long as she could remember. The next fortnight was a delightful one to Mabel, and indeed to all the party. Every day they went driving, excursions through the country round. Ramsgate and Deal and Folkestone were visited, and they drove over to Canterbury and spent a night there visiting the grand cathedral and the old walls. The weather was too cold for the water, for Christmas was close at hand, but everything that could be done was done to make the time pass happily. Mrs. Conway exerted herself to lay aside her regrets at Ralph's approaching departure, and to enter into the happiness which Mr. Penfold so evidently felt. The day before their departure for town an official letter arrived for Ralph, announcing that he was gazetted into His Majesty's 28th Regiment of Foot, and that he was in 1 month's date from that of his appointment to join his regiment at Cork. "Now, Miss Mabel," Mr. Penfold said gaily, after the first talk over the commission was concluded, "you will have for the future to treat Mr. Ralph Conway with the respect due to an officer in His Majesty's service." "Oh, I don't see any change in him at present," the girl said, examining Ralph gravely. The boy burst into a laugh. "Will you see him in uniform, Mabel?" Mr. Penfold went on. "I am afraid that respect is one of the moral qualities in which you are deficient. Still, I think that when you see Ralph in uniform you will be struck with awe." "Oh, I don't think so," Mabel said, shaking her head. "I don't think he will frighten me, and I feel almost sure that he won't frighten the Frenchman." "My dear child," Mr. Penfold said gravely, "you don't know what Ralph is going to turn out yet. When you see him come back from the wars 7 or 8 inches taller than he is now, with great whiskers and perhaps 3 or 4 ornamental scars on his face, you'll be quite shocked when you reflect that you once treated this warrior as a playfellow." Upon the following day the party went up to London, and were joined next morning by Mr. and Mrs. Withers. Mabel declared that she did not think any people ever could have enjoyed themselves so much as they all did. They went to Exeter Change to see the animals, and to the theatre at Drury Lane, to the Tower and Ranelagh Gardens, to Westminster Abbey and St. Paul's, and they went down by coach to Hampton Court and to Greenwich, and they saw His Majesty the King review the Guards in Hyde Park. Altogether it was a glorious fortnight. Mr. Penfold was the life and soul of the party, and had he had his way they would have seen far more than they did. But Mr. and Mrs. Withers and Mrs. Conway all said that they wanted to enjoy themselves and not to be worn out, and several times they stayed at home when Mr. Penfold and the 2 young people went to see sights, or to wander about the streets and look at the shops, which was as great a treat as anything. Mr. Penfold went with Ralph to a military tailor, and ordered his outfit, and to other shops, where he purchased such a stock of other garments that Mrs. Conway declared Ralph would require nothing for years. On the last day of the fortnight the uniforms and trunks and clothes all arrived at the hotel, and of course Ralph had to dress up and buckle on his sword for the first time. Mrs. Conway shed a few tears, and would have shed more had not Mr. Penfold made everyone laugh so, and Mabel was seized with a fit of shyness for the first time in her life, when Mr. Penfold insisted that the ladies should all kiss the young officer in honour of the occasion. And the next morning the whole party went down to the wharf below London Bridge to see Ralph on board the packet for Cork. Before leaving the hotel Mr. Penfold slipped an envelope with 10 crisp £5 notes in it into Ralph's hand. "I have paid in, my boy, £200 to the regimental agents, and in future shall make you an allowance of the same amount every year. You will see what other officers spend. My advice to you is, do not spend more than others, and do not spend less. Money will keep very well, you know, and a little reserve may always come in useful. When you once go on foreign service you will not find much occasion for money. I want you just to hold your own with others. I consider that it's quite as unfortunate for a young man to spend more than those around him as it is for him to be unable to spend as much. No, I don't want any thanks at all. I told your mother I should look after you, and I am going to, and it has given me a vast pleasure to have such an interest. Write to me occasionally, my boy. Your letters will give me great pleasure, and should you get into any scrape, tell me frankly all about it." The evening before, Mrs. Conway had had a long talk with Ralph. "I do not think I need to give you much advice, my boy. You have already been out in the world on your own account, and have shown that you can make your way. You are going into a life, Ralph, which has many temptations. Do not give way to them, my boy. Above all, set your face against what is the curse of our times, overindulgence in wine. It's the ruin of thousands. Do not think it's manly to be vicious because you see others are. Always live, if you can, so that if you keep a true diary you could hand it to me to read without a blush on your cheek. And always bear in mind that though I shall not be there to see you, a higher and purer eye will be upon you. You'll try, won't you, Ralph?" "Oh, I will indeed, mother." Mr. Penfold did his best to keep up the spirits of all the party when they parted on board the packet, but Mrs. Conway quite broke down at last. Mabel cried unrestrainedly, and his own eyes had a suspicious moisture in them as he shook hands with Ralph. Fortunately they had arrived a little late at the wharf, and the partings were consequently cut short. The bell rang and all the visitors were hurried ashore. Then the hawsers were thrown off and the sails hoisted. As long as the party remained in sight, Ralph stood on the stern waving his handkerchief to them. Then, having removed the traces of tears from his cheeks, he turned to look at what was going on around him. The packet was a brig of about 200 tons, and she carried about 20 passengers, of whom fully half Ralph judged, by their appearance, to be military men. Before they had reached the mouth of the river he found that one among them, Captain O'Connor, belonged to his own regiment, as did another young fellow about his own age named Stapleton, who had been gazetted on the same day as himself. Captain O'Connor, who was a cheery Irishman, full of life and spirits, at once took Ralph in hand, and was not long in drawing from him the story of his adventures with the privateers. "You will do, my lad. I can see you have got the roughness rubbed off you already, and will get on capitally with the regiment. I can't say as much for that young fellow Stapleton. He seems to be completely puffed up with a sense of his own importance, and to be an unlicked sort of cub altogether. However, I've known more unlikely subjects than he to turn out decent fellows after a course of instruction from the boys. But he'll have rather a rough time of it at first, I expect. You'll be doing him a kindness if you take an opportunity to tell him that a newly joined ensign is not regarded in the same light as a commander-in-chief. It's like a new boy going to school, you know. If fellows find out he's a decent sort of boy, they soon let him alone, but if he's an ass, especially a conceited ass, he has rather a rough time of it. As you are in the same cabin with him, and have had the advantage of having knocked about the world a bit, you might gently hint this to him." "Oh, I have been chatting with him a bit," Ralph said. "He has never been to school, but has been brought up at home, and I think from what he said he is the heir to an estate. He seemed rather to look down upon schools." "Oh, so much the worse for him," Captain O'Connor said. "There's nothing like a school for bringing a fellow to his level, unless it's a regiment, and the earlier in life the process takes place the less painful it is." "I don't think he'll turn out to be a bad sort of fellow," Ralph said. "He is, as you say, rather an ass at present. I will do what I can to give him a hint, but as I would say he is at least a year older than I am, I don't suppose it will be much use." The voyage was a pleasant one, and Ralph was quite sorry when they entered the cove of Cork and dropped anchor. The next morning the ship sailed up the river, and the following day the party disembarked. Captain O'Connor's servant came on board as soon as the vessel reached the quay, and his master charged him to pick out his luggage and that of the two young officers. He then at once proceeded with them to the barracks. Ralph felt extremely pleased that Captain O'Connor was with them, as he felt none of the shyness and unpleasantness he would otherwise have experienced in joining a set of entire strangers. Captain O'Connor was evidently a favourite in the regiment, for his arrival was heartily greeted. He at once introduced the two lads to their future comrades, took them to the colonel, looked after their quarters, and made them at home. In their absence he spoke warmly in favour of Ralph. "You'll find Conway a first-rate young fellow. He's seen somewhat of the world, and has been carried out to the West Indies by a French privateersman, and has gone through a lot of adventures. He's a bright, pleasant, good-tempered fellow. The other's as green as grass, and has never been away from his mother's apron string. However, I do not think you will find him a bad sort of fellow when he's got rid of his rawness. Don't be too hard upon him, boys. Remember, easy does it, and don't be pushing your jokes too far. He's not a fool, and will come round in time."